Chev, they say defense wins championships. And today we're going to go over our nuggets to know for the 2025 season for DST.
Welcome to the FF Face Off, where fantasy football is debated.
All right, Chev. So we have a good, fun show lined up today. Before we get started, Chev, let me ask you, are you a streamer of defenses, or are you one that tries to get one higher in a draft when you are, drafting in your redraft managed leagues? Are you one that kind of waits for a defense? What's your methodology usually going into drafts?
Dude, listen, I'm team stream. Like, I've got the strongest urethra known to man. Okay. I do not waste any sort of time on, like, I'll go in with an illegal lineup just so I can figure out where the best matchups and stuff are coming into a week, especially week one. Like, we just don't know what we don't know. We can go off some of the information, but not to be long-winded with the answer, but I'm team stream the way that I found you long before you knew who I was. Like, I started following your work as far as like the stream stuff goes. So I'm team stream all the way.
Yeah, we're gonna definitely dive into a little bit as to the streaming and just to go into that and as many of the viewers know and like yourself, right? Like last year was a great year for us when it came to streaming defenses. I think defenses, like anything in football, we try to project as much as possible, but there's going to be, curveballs. There's going to be things that unfortunately we can't, project in a model or prepare for the season and, halfway through the season. And so defenses are kind of like relievers in baseball, right? Where, they can be volatile year over year. It's
Mhm.
not like that as much with offenses because, the quarterback, if you have a franchise guy, they're at least staying and there's continuity there. And it's the same guy controlling the offense and at the quarterback position, where defense is really truly 11 guys playing together. Yeah, you have the guy with the green dot in the middle of the field that's calling the plays, but ultimately, defense is a lot of reaction, where with offense, it's a lot of, controlling and manning the ship, right? So it's a little bit easier to project year over year because, there's a lot more continuity on that side of the ball. But looking at, DST from last year, seven of the top 10 DSTs, Chev, last year in ADP did not make the top 10 in total fantasy points. And I put together a chart here, right? And this shows DST preseason ADP versus total fantasy points. And the best way to look at this chart here is if you're if the red dot for you is above the black line, that means you underperformed your expectations, and if it's below the black line, that means you overperformed expectations. And if we take a look at the end of this chart, you have the Denver Broncos, you have the Los Angeles Chargers, and the Rams, who severely exceeded expectations. You can even look at the Vikings and the Packers, right? These are all teams that are drafted well after the top 15 draft selections in ADP before the season started. And those teams all outperformed their ADP. And so to go back towards the streaming aspect of it, you had mentioned matchups and you're trying to play them. That's what I try to do too. I feel like, Chev, when I draft a defense, if I do draft a defense higher, right? Like, if in the past, like before I started getting into really looking into the streaming side of things, I would take a defense, decently high in my draft because there's always like a defense run. Like, who's going to take the first defense in your league in a draft? And, you spend sometimes decent high capital and it's a really good defense, but you don't get to play those matchups. And then you kind of, in my opinion, feel married because you've invested sometimes a decent amount of capital in a draft. And so, you either stuck picking up a second defense to stream because you don't want to let go of your defense you drafted, or you just find yourself rolling with the defense no matter what the matchups are that you drafted because they're just a good defense overall. And so that's why I try my best to not draft a defense. And to your point, a lot of times I'll go with an illegal lineup too until week one, where I'll just take an extra skill player, like a young guy, take a Ja'Cory Krosky Merritt, right? Where like maybe there's some upside where they can, carve out a role before week one, and if not, just drop them for the defense, that I need to start for the first week.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a beautiful thing about the DSTs. Like, for example, looking at week one, we're talking about streaming defenses. Like, we know that Kansas City year over year has been a really good real life NFL defense, but they're playing the Chargers week one. Do you really want to throw them out there in Brazil against Justin Herbert in week one? Another example, the Ravens. The Ravens are playing the Bills in week one. Like, both of those are tremendous defenses. But do you want to take one of those guys in the 14th round and then week one have to go out and fade Josh Allen to get some fantasy production from your defense? So that's why the streaming aspect of this is very important. And I think that we're going to get into the weeds a little bit. And that's why I've been looking forward to this episode for so long, because we're going to get into the weeds of like how you find those and identify those matchups.
Yeah, and the week one thing is also super important, right? I think when we talk about, fantasy football, it is so important to get off to a hot start, right? If you can get off to a hot start, right, and start strong, it sets up the rest of the season. When injuries start to come up, when buys start to come up, you're not sweating it nearly as much. And it also, in my opinion, allows you to have more speculative players on your bench, because when injuries come, and if you're in a good spot, like you might not drop a guy that you think might have a good second half of the season, like a Luther Burden, right, or somebody. But looking at week one, because it is important to get off to a hot start. You mentioned, right, a lot of good defenses have really, really tough matchups. And, I think the defense, or the matchup maybe that sticks out to me the most, would probably be the Commanders versus the Giants, right? Commanders, when you look at the Commanders, they are not a defense that's getting picked very high, right? Defense overall 22, right? That's a defense that in your drafts, very unlikely they're going to get drafted. So that could be a defense that you target, right? Because you're streaming and you take them week one, right? And they play the Giants. And look, I think the Giants will be improved with Russell Wilson, but the Commanders added Von Miller, right? They added some pieces on defense. Dan Quinn's a good defensive coach, and they're also at home. And the Giants are running with a new quarterback, right? And I don't expect them to put up a high-powered game, and we know Russell Wilson takes sacks, right? So it's just a good example of like, you wouldn't have to draft the Commanders week one, but they get a really good matchup, and you wouldn't have to draft them and waste time or capital on them.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And two, like another thing, I don't know if we're going to segue into that right now, but
Yeah, go for it.
turnovers. We talked about like turnovers and sacks, and Russell Wilson, for all of his, Russ magic in the Seattle days, he is basically a sack machine now. So you talked about the Commanders adding Von Miller, and that pass rush last year was sixth in sack percentage, amongst all teams in the NFL. Like, one thing about Dan Quinn, everywhere he's been, is his team finds a way to rush the passer. Frankie Louvu took an incredible step forward last year, kind of finally finding like that role. It looked comically bad. I remember watching every snap of the Commanders defense in week one last year, and it started out comically bad. But again, Dan Quinn gets this sort of belief. He's got the green dot, and Bobby Wagner. We talked about green dots on defense a little bit. Bobby Wagner's still playing at a Hall of Fame all pro caliber level, second team all pro last year. They add Von Miller. Marshawn Lattimore, if he stays healthy, is going to kind of be a game changer for Joe Witt's defense. So yeah, I absolutely love the Commanders in week one, because we're going to get an opportunity to get a lot of sacks, potentially get some turnovers. If Russ doesn't finish the game and Jameis comes in, it's just a smorgasbord of fantasy goodness for everybody, where DST can give you like 20 points and you can still get fantasy production. So yes, that's a great point. So I'm anxious to see where we go from here.
Yeah, and that's a good segue, right? So we talked a little bit about, the week 1, and I would say, when before we get into the next topic, which is going to be more turnovers and sacks, right? When I stream defenses, and anybody that watches my weekly defensive streamers, right? The biggest thing that I look at when trying to select a defense is low Vegas implied point totals, right? I always look at Vegas and I look at their point totals on the week to see what they're projecting, right? Look, Vegas does not have a time machine. They don't have a crystal ball to tell us this is what's going to happen, but for the majority of the time, especially with point totals, they're pretty close, right? So I use that as a baseline, right? And then I also like to look at defenses versus bad offenses in terms of EPA. Now, you're not going to get that until a couple weeks into the season, right? We can't really use EPA because there's not enough data to go off of, right? We could use it maybe in a 1 or 2 game sample size, but you're really not getting. You want more data. But then I also look at home teams, right? So low Vegas implied totals, defenses versus bad offensive EPAs, home teams, and then sacks, right? Sacks is the fourth part there, especially if we don't have enough data on the EPA side. You mentioned sacks. We talked about the turnovers. It's super important. Last year, Denver, 63 sacks. They were the number 1 DST. And someone might sit here and say, okay, well, it's as simple as just saying whoever gets the most sacks is going to be, the defense that you want. And right, it's not completely perfect like that, but it to not overcomplicate things too. Like, yeah, I mean, if you really don't want to, do the time right and try to prep it right, then I would just look at sacks and maybe low point totals and call it a day, right? But if you do want the more heavy insight, right? That's why I do the DSG streamers every week. And so I'll do the work for you. I'll break it down. I'll give you that understanding. And we're excited to see where that heads this year. But Chev, talk to me a little bit about the interceptions from last year, right? And do you see some of these teams that, had high interception rates in 2024? Is that something that you see them maybe being able to replicate in 2025?
So the top three teams in terms of interception rate from 2024, the Lions, who play some of the most sticky man coverage in the entire league, but they lost. They lost Aaron Glenn, so we'll see. We'll see what that like. If it still stays the same, like you've got a good thing going. You got Kirby, you've got Kirby Joseph, you got Brian Branch, you've got some young stud in Terry and Arnold. So there's three teams that posted a 3% INT rate in 2024. The Lions, who we just talked about, they allowed 12 passing touchdowns in 2024, that's absolutely ridiculous over the course of a season. The Texans, who are the only team with an 8% sack rate and a 3% INT rate in non-garbage time, like the sack rate. And they just added CJ Gardner-Johnson, who's one of the best at taking the ball away. He's got the fourth most interceptions since 2022. They're number 1 in negative EPA per play, and they allowed the third lowest QB rating in the entire NFL. And then you got the Vikings, who everybody knows that was everybody's DST darling. Brian Flores just absolutely, the clip went viral last year of Brian Flores after the game. Brock Purdy walks up to him and is like, "You had me in a blender." And that's like year over year stuff. So Monday Night Football in 2023, I want to say, he was absolute. I mean, Brock Purdy got concussed, but he was absolutely getting fried by Brian Flores' defense. Then last year, they were just nails for most of the season. They were, first in interceptions, fourth in sacks. They did lose Cam Bynum, but they added Javon Hargrave and Jonathan Allen. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out. I mean, Brian Flores is just one of the best minds in the game right now. So that's something. Those are things that I had my eye on and in prepping for this episode. So
Sure.
curious to see what your thoughts are as far as that goes.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Brian Flores thing, it's fun to talk about Flores and his defense and what he does, right? I mean, Flores, all the simulated pressures, right? And if you're not familiar with the simulated pressure, right, it's the act of pretty much like making it seem like you're going to be sending a blitz and really only coming with 4, right? So, you'll see this mug look on defense where a lot of it's really like 2 linebackers, kind of pressed up in the A gap, on the line of scrimmage, right? Like showing a heavy blitz, right? The offense has to prepare for, making checks at the line of, identifying who the mic is and just shifting pass protection, maybe bringing in, maybe keeping the running back into block, right? And then they'll go out and they won't blitz and they'll still be able to either possibly get home, right, with the 4, or, they'll be able to create enough, in the quarterback's head where they get the ball out quickly, assuming there's going to be, heavy pressure, right? And so that's to give a little bit of a background on that. But yeah, I mean, I'm excited to see what D'Amico Ryans does too. With this defense, that defense continues to get better, in my opinion. Getting CJGJ is a nice addition. You have Stingley, who, look, Pat Surtain got Defensive Player of the Year, but honestly, Stingley was not that far off, in my honest opinion, from him. And that's coming from a Broncos fan who is gonna love looking back on it and saying we got a corner to win Defensive Player of the Year, and it was on the Broncos. Selfishly, like that's something that'll be cool to look back on. It was a great season by Surtain, but Stingley is great too. But let me shift gears here a little bit and talk about the defensive EPA, right? And we showed a lot of these charts last year when we did our defensive streamers, and EPA, it's important, right? It's good to kind of it's kind of good to go over EPA on a week by week basis. And for those that don't exactly know, right, it's really more of a statistic and a measurement, in football, where let me pull up the exact definition here, but it's expected points added, right? So it's really pretty much a metric that football analytics use to assess the value on each play, and it measures how much it increases or decreases a team's expected score. And so when you look at that chart, the highest teams in EPA was Minnesota, Denver, Philly, Green Bay. Crazy enough, we talked about Detroit. Detroit was 7 last year in EPA per play. And that's a defense that was absolutely ravaged by injuries. I don't think you look at that team last year and think, okay, that defense was good. Like, I don't really think that when I look back at Detroit. But Aaron Glenn, made a lot of patchwork. They lost Hutchinson. They lost a lot of guys in the secondary. They lost Anzalone for a lot of time. And so it's interesting to see Detroit up there, and Miami too. Miami was 8th in EPA. I expect that defense to regress a lot this year. They lost a lot of pieces. But what do you expect with Aaron Glenn and the Jets? I know this is not really something that we specifically prepped, but curious to get your thoughts on Aaron Glenn as maybe a DC, and just your thoughts on that Jets defense.
So they're really interesting because of the fact that they play so much sticky man coverage, and they run like traps, and they'll like show a middle open look and then rotate a safety to make it, middle closed. And all of this is just kind of the genius of what Aaron Glenn had built with the versatility of athletes that he had in the secondary in Detroit, with Kirby Joseph and Brian Branch being like just chess. Like you can roll one down and put one in the slot and just have one like patrol the middle of the field. You can blitz Brian Branch. Like it's so unique in what they have. So I'm interested to see how he takes what his philosophy is and he marries that up with a guy like Sauce Gardner and that just monstrosity of a defensive line that they have, and they've got Quinnen Williams' older brother. I think he's going to wear the green dot now that CJ Mosley retired, Quincy Williams. So it's going to be interesting to see how those principles bear themselves out. I would lean towards they're still going to play a ton of man coverage because of the fact that defensive line is so good. It's like, hey, if I give you 2.5 to 3 seconds, these guys are going to get home. We're talking, you're hearing the reports out of camp that Will McDonald put on 15 pounds, and he was already one of the most dynamic pass rushers in the NFL as a young player last year. So now he's adding 10 to 15 pounds of muscle, if I'm not mistaken, 15 pounds, if I'm not mistaken. And he talked about having to eat like 6,000 calories a day. So Maybe he didn't go to a street pharmacist in Mexico to get a boost, but yeah. So it's going to be interesting to see how Aaron Glenn takes what was successful in Detroit, not having that level of not that amount of time spent, that buy-in, and then additionally, like what those pieces, outside of Sauce Gardner, I believe that they lost DJ Reed. So yeah, they did lose. They did lose DJ Reed, if I'm
Yeah,
not
DJ
mistaken.
Reed went to the Chargers.
Yeah, so he's him being one of the most versatile inside outside slot to outside corners in the game. It's going to be really interesting to see how they pull this off. But I think that they should be really good because that defensive line is going to afford them some opportunities to create havoc in games where teams just don't have the personnel to match up on the offensive line.
Yeah, and I have when it comes to the Jets at least, and I think the Jets spent so much time and so much draft capital on these defensive linemen, right? And trying to get returns out of them, high end draft capital. And when I look at the Jets, right, I broke it down. And the Jets right now are my fifth ranked defense. Now strength of schedule wise, they come in at 11. So they're in a more favorable schedule, in terms of their matchups this year, coming in at 11th. When you look at the Jets and their sacks last year, they averaged 2.5 sacks per game, right? So that was good to be in the top 10, even a little bit higher. And overall, we know Aaron Glenn, as you said, is going to be a guy that's going to, have this defense ready to go. I hope and pray that the offense can keep them off the field and sustain drives, because I think that'll be one of the biggest challenges, for that defense is getting a break because,
Yeah.
it's a young offense with Fields and we don't really know what to expect.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's going to so I like a lot of what the Jets have done from an offseason perspective. Again, continuing to invest in the trenches. It's a lot like what happened in Detroit when Brad Holmes and when Brad Holmes and Motor City Dan Campbell, they got together and they built the team through the trenches. They controlled the game with the running game, and then they just let the pass rushers just go hunt. Like you get Aiden Hutchinson, who is an unequivocal hit. He was no shade to Patrick Surtain, but that was the defensive player of the year before he breaks his leg. 7.5 sacks in 5 games.
Yeah.
5-sack games. So they're going to, if Will McDonald can be that approximation of Aiden Hutchinson for Aaron Glenn, this is going to be a really dangerous defense.
Yeah, I mean, and I would agree with that too. And the point of Hutchinson, I think is fair, right? Because we see so many times in the past. I mean, that's why it's so rare to see it's so rare to see a defender that's a corner, win defensive player of the year, because the counting stats aren't there, right? With edge defenders, right? I mean, you can look at sacks, right, on a baseline level and say, okay, look, this is how many sacks a guy had, right? And they're leading the league in this or that. So I think that's a good point with Hutchinson, and I definitely think he could have had a good shot. Now, shifting gears here because we do love to stream. We did give out the Commanders as a defense to take a look at to stream for week 1. But looking at some of the top DST schedules for the playoffs, right? It's hard to project now. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you need to be taking defenses and picking them up and stashing them for the playoffs. But just to keep them on your radar, because some of these defenses, right, like at least 2 of them, I don't expect to be I expect them to be drafted, right? And one of them may not. But the 49ers get the Titans, the Colts, and the Bears. The 49ers are a defense that, for me, I'm expecting to play above expectations this year. I'm really excited for this 49ers defense, right? Last year, the 49ers defense, especially against the run, Chev, they struggled tremendously. And when I look back at the 49ers and just some of the additions, right, they lose Hargrave, they lose Hufanga, and I think a lot of people, I think a lot of people assume that this defense is going to take a very severe step back. I think what's important to remember is they didn't have Hufanga, they didn't have Dre Greenlaw. Like, those guys were injured for pretty much the entire season, and so losing them is not as detrimental as people think. The defense was bad without them regardless last year. So I don't expect it to be like, oh, this is that people expect this team to be like a rebuilder and, that they might take a step back this year. They have a really easy schedule. They really address the defensive line in the draft as well. I'm going to pull up some of those key additions. But what are your thoughts on the 49ers? They get Robert Saleh back. Is that a defense that would have intrigue for you?
So I'm glad you brought that up because the 49ers are one of the most intriguing cases in all of fantasy. So last year, you kind of saw the Super Bowl hangover that teams that lose the Super Bowl have, and then they were just ravaged by injury. They lose, and then they lose. You mentioned they lost Talanoa Hufanga, they lost Dre Greenlaw, but they spent almost all their they lost Travarius Ward. They lost a ton of guys that had been familiar names in the San Francisco lexicon for quite some time. So you're talking about, but then they get Robert Saleh back. Robert Saleh, who famously cut his teeth. They were, for a while, Kyle Shanahan was just pumping out defensive coordinators as head coaches. So you went from D'Amico Ryans to Robert Saleh. Then we go over to, I think it was Steve Wilkes, who famously just was not making adjustments in the Super Bowl, and that's why he was let go. They did the Nick Sorensen experiment for a year. Now we're back to Robert Saleh again, and I think that they're going to take a huge step forward because of how physical they reinvested. So they saw the problem that we saw and they couldn't stop the run for anything last year. So they invested heavily in the trenches, and they got a bunch of guys that I like CJ West, who's a nose tackle who's just an absolute people eater. And They got Michael Williams with the 11th pick of the first round. So really excited to see how this plays out. I think that they're going to be a lot tougher against the run, that's important because you've got two of the run heaviest teams in the Rams and the Cardinals. And you think that the Seahawks are going that direction too with Clint Kubiak. So I think that what they did in the draft was really important to kind of get back to level setting and them being one of the hardest teams to run the football on.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be a big start, right? And having Salah back, I get it. Salah's not necessarily a guy that's on the field, so he doesn't make an impact that way. But it can't be. I think you need the Jimmies and Joes to make the plays, but
Mhm.
the X's and O's are still important too. I think you need a good blend of both, right? Especially on defense. Offense, you can get by with having a really, really awesome quarterback that can make up for maybe, the deficiencies of the OC, but on defense, right? It's the defense coordinators should, in my opinion, get a little bit more credit than the OCs, just because you're not playing with as much control as that coordinator, right? And so you really have to be creative, know your matchups. And when we look at Robert Saleh, right, I expect him to have this defense bounce back. If you look at the 49ers run defense last year, 46.9 in terms of their defensive line against the run, that's 26th in the NFL. Malik Collins, is gone. Javon Hargrave is gone. Leonard Floyd is gone. All those guys had atrocious run defense grades. They bring in Michael Williams, elite length, versatile in alignment. Bring in Alfred Collins, who has long arms, good positional flexibility. And then you mentioned CJ West, big player, right? Huge, like when I say big, not like he's a big dude. Um, and just a high energy disruptor. And then I just also look at some of the slot and nickel upgrades they made. They brought in Upton Stout and they brought in Marquis Single, who also had pretty solid run defense grades as well. So that should help out in the secondary. But let's also talk a little bit here, Chev. I have two other defenses. And I do want to note with the 49ers, I think the 49ers have a really good chance to beat out where they're being drafted. So if you are looking to draft, but you don't want to draft one of these high end defenses, the 49ers right now are 8th overall in DST rankings. They go 206 off the board compared to the Broncos, who go 155. So if you are looking to draft somebody, regardless of the 49ers, playoff schedule, this is a defense or at least a team that has the best strength of schedule on the entire board. So That's a defense to take a look at. Looking at the other two defenses, Texans, they get the Cardinals, the Raiders, and the Chargers. I expect the Raiders to be better with Pete Carroll, right? I expect the Chargers to be solid. Cardinals have their mistakes, so at least the Texans will give you a good matchup, at least week one. We know what Kyler does under duress. He's one of the best, but at the same time, right, I'm not a big believer in that Cardinals offense taking a step forward. A lot's going
Yeah.
to happen from now until then anyway, but that was just another team I identified on there. And then the last one for me was the Bills, who get the Patriots in the first week. They get the Browns in week 2, which who knows who the Browns are going to be starting at that point in week 2
Exactly.
of the fantasy playoffs. And then they get the Eagles, right? You're not going to start them against the Eagles, right? At that point, you drop them, and you can probably stream a defense at that point. But those are the three defenses I picked. Do you have any thoughts on those three defenses? Do you think those schedules are solid? I tried to look. It's so hard to project the schedules because, there's not a ton of offenses that you point at yet and say, yeah, they're going to be horrendous.
Right.
And, I figure that 49ers probably the best schedule on the board there with the Titans, Colts, and Bears.
Yeah, absolutely. That is chef's kiss. Like, can't get any better. Can't get any better than that. I think with the 49ers, it's just going to kind of come down to can Nick Bosa get back to his original like defensive player of the year type of form if he's healthy, and then they should be able to stop the run unless all these dudes can't play dead that they added in free agency in the offseason. They should be able to stop the run, force teams to pass. And that at that point, like, you're just throwing the ball up and saying good luck if Nick Bosa is getting a scream off the edge. So I think that's gonna be great. This Bills playoff schedule. Now, obviously, again, you hit on the fact that, like, hey, we don't know what it's going to look like almost 4 months from now in terms of attrition, in terms of injuries, like, just schematic changes because of your personnel. Like, there's a lot of unknowns in terms of actual football being played, but being able to start, if we're talking about DST lineups, doing fantasy lineups, like, the Bills are going to be, I bet you the Bills would be one of the most played lineups in week 15 against the Patriots. And then
Yeah.
again in week 16 against the Browns. Now, choose your own adventure if you choose to play them against the Eagles in championship week. But I still think that, I mean, all it takes is like one turnover, like one random fluke pick six, and now or fumble recovery for a touchdown, and you made money. So they'll be one of the least played defenses in week 17. I can tell you that much right now.
Yeah, the only thing that sucks about the Bills is that the first 2 weeks are on the road there with the playoffs with the Patriots and the Browns. And look, the Patriots, I'm expecting them to take a step forward. So we'll see. I mean, divisional games, still a young quarterback. I would hope by that late in the season they've started to really gel as an offense. But let's move on to the last thing here, Chev, and let's just talk about our rankings here. I have my rankings up. I don't have your rankings up, so this is going to be more of a surprise for me. But let's talk about. I have my top 12 rankings, and I just flashed them on the board here, right? So right now, Chev, I have it as Denver's number one. Denver, right, eighth in strength of schedule, so a top 10 strength of schedule. That's great. 3.6 sacks per game last year. Negative 0.1 in terms of EPA. So we talked about them, but they were number 2 in EPA last year for defenses, right behind the Minnesota Vikings. And points per game, right? They had 19, right? So I'm expecting good things from Denver. Chargers have another really good schedule. They're number 2 on strength of schedule. Minnesota Vikings schedule not as favorable, 22. I still expect them to generate a lot of sacks, some turnovers. Baltimore Ravens are 14th in strength of schedule, so not bad, not great, right? It's a pretty even schedule. Then I have the Eagles here at 5. And Eagles don't have a great schedule this year either. 26th in strength to schedule. The lower the number, or I guess the higher the number, so in this case 26, that means that their schedule is pretty bad, right? And I just expect that defense to be good. But then I have the Texans, I have the Packers, I have Seattle, I have the Bills, I have the Steelers, I have Los Angeles Rams, and then I have the Chiefs. I have the Chiefs at 12. I wanted to find a way to put them up a little bit higher. But with the Steelers getting Watt extended, I like what they have going on in that front 7. They brought in Jalen Ramsey. They brought in Darius Slay. Porter is going into his sophomore season in the secondary. So that secondary should be pretty good. And so I thought about maybe bumping them up ahead of the Steelers, but I just couldn't do it. So that's kind of where my rankings are, Chev. Are these close to yours? Do you want to give off your full rankings, or do you want to just tell me, if there's any, where are we in line here? Start with that first.
As I'm not the guru of DST that you are, I'll go with top 5, and it's fairly chalk, but I just there's I don't know. I didn't realize maybe I have such an affinity for defenses that have CJ Gardner-Johnson. So my top 5 might be a little bit different than yours. So obviously, Denver, there's no reason to question what Vance Joseph and Sean Payton have cooking up there. Number 1 in sacks. They just extended Zach Allen with that massive deal. And so I think that this is going to be sticky. They've got the pass catchers, they've got the pass defenders in place they drafted Jahdae Barron. I think that's going to be an unequivocal hit. You've got the defensive player of the year. You've got Riley Moss, who, even though he had a horrible week 17 against the Bengals.
Yeah.
Against T. Higgins. I was thinking T. Higgins, and I was like, T. Higgins, and I just couldn't spit his team name out. Then you've got Minnesota, who we sung the praises of Brian Flores already, and what he's able to generate. And they've added 2 run stuffers / Javon Hargrave is a plus pass rusher from the defensive tackle spot. Andrew Van Ginkel is one of the most versatile linebackers that nobody talks. He's just now getting the type of love that I feel like he deserves after years in Miami, and what he put on film last year. And then I'm going to Houston. One of the, like I said, the only team with an 8% sack rate and a 3% interception rate, and they add CJ Gardner-Johnson. CJ Gardner-Johnson is just he forces turnovers, and he discourages activity over the middle of the field. He's one of the most versatile, whether you like him or hate him, he's one of the most versatile safeties in the game. So I think that him being added adds another chess piece to already Jalen Petrie, Derek Stingley, what they've got going on with Danielle Hunter and Will Anderson. I think that this defense is gonna surprise some people this year, and they were really good last year. And then 4th, I have Green Bay. Joe Hafley changed the culture. Edgerrin Cooper as their green dot is going to make a tremendous difference for Sean Gary. That defensive line has taken a step forward with him being healthy. And I really like what they've got going on with Devontae Wyatt. Kenny Clark is one of the just most reliable defensive tackles, not spectacular like some of the other guys at the position, but one of the most underappreciated. And then last but not least, Baltimore Ravens. I mean, they stole Mike Green in the 2nd round. They've got, they've got Adafe Owe, one of the most freakishly athletic people. They brought back Kyle Van Noy, who had 14 sacks at age 35 or 37 or how old. He's closer to my age than he is being a 21-year-old spring chicken. He's out there recording 14 sacks. Kyle Hamilton's arguably the most versatile safety in the game. So the one thing that they do in Baltimore is play great defense. It just so happens that now they've got a generational quarterback to go with it. So they're going to force a lot of people to have very, very bad days this year. And I want to be in on them. But again, I'm not going to draft them. If someone wants to just take the L on week 1, then by all means do so. But I can't draft them in week 1. In the 14th round or, one of the last rounds of my draft, knowing that they got to go see Josh Allen on Sunday night in week 1.
You're likely going to have to carry 2 defenses, because I'm not going to roll out a defense against Josh Allen week 1 and get off to a bad start because I got like 1 or 2 points or possibly even negative. Now, right. I'm pretty sure they did play Josh Allen pretty tough to begin the year last year.
They did.
Bills had a pretty bad game there. So, that we've seen it. But what I would say about the Ravens is, I mean, Nate Wiggins, who was drafted in 2024, right, out of Clemson. Really like Nate Wiggins. You mentioned Kyle Hamilton. Not much has to be said about him, as you said. Probably one of, if not the most versatile safeties in the game. They also drafted Malachi Starks this year, who
Yes.
kind of not fell into their lap, but safeties are not. Teams don't draft safeties as high, even if they are one of the best players in the draft. It's just
Yes.
positional value. They also brought in Jair Alexander, who, when healthy, is I wouldn't say he's a top 5 corner, but I would say he's around the top 10. And then you have
Very
Marlon
much so.
Humphrey.
Yes.
So that secondary should be better. They had some issues in that secondary last year, which I think was some of their detriment. But overall, that's a fun team. And then I'm really looking forward to the Rams in terms of just a defense. What is
Oh
a
my
defense that
goodness.
you're looking forward to? Is there, before we close out, is there a defense that sticks out to you that you're excited to see what they look like in 2025?
Oh yeah, it's gonna be the Seattle Seahawks. So the former defensive coordinator for the Ravens, who led them to so much success, Lamar's first MVP year. He didn't win the MVP last year, but they were dominant on the defensive side of the football last year or that year. And now he's over in Seattle. He's got what we think could be one of the most versatile defensive pieces in Devon Witherspoon. You've got Tariq Woolen there. They draft Nick Emanwari, who literally broke the model for RAS score, and he's been making plays all throughout camp. If you guys haven't been following, the Seattle beat writers just can't say enough positive things about Nick Emanwari, rookie safety out of South Carolina. Just kind of think about a more athletic Cam Chancellor. Now, he doesn't play like Cam Chancellor because he's not an axe murderer, and that's not allowed anymore. But I think he's going to be tremendous. So the Seahawks are a team that I've kind of got my eyes on in terms of them taking a step forward defensively. They added Ernest Jones, who the Titans traded to them mid-season. And you kind of saw, so they were basically a sieve defensively for the first 7 weeks of the season. They get Ernest Jones, everything flips a switch, and then they start adding pieces. And I think that they're going to take a step forward and really surprise some people this year.
Yeah, Ernest Jones has had a weird career arc. He's got moved around a ton the last few seasons, and he's very good, very underrated player.
Yeah.
Um, for me, the Rams, I talked about them. They're probably the team I'm most excited to see. It's really Jared Verse, man. I loved him coming out. You can go into my archives. I'm not just victory lapping, but Jared Verse was my favorite edge defender last year. I love Jared Verse coming in out of Boston College, out of FSU.
Yeah.
Same
Similar
color.
colors.
Yeah, out of FSU. FSU has such a long history of bringing in
Badass
really
defensive
good
lineman.
defense linemen.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh my God.
Yes.
They do bring in Chris Paul Jr. Now he was a 5th-round pick,
I
and
was a
he's
big
probably
fan.
not
I
going
was
to
surprised
start.
he felt like that.
Yeah, crazy enough, like I actually I follow Chris Paul Jr.'s dad on Twitter, and I wished him good luck during the combine, but we didn't
Nice.
chat too much. But I was really excited about Chris Paul. I was surprised he went as late as he did out of Mississippi, but I'm
Mm-hmm.
excited to see him there. And I just overall love the defense. Right, you have Brendan Fisk, you have Poona Ford. Coming over from the Chargers, who should be playing nose tackle for them.
Bro, Poona Ford is one of the most underrated players in the entire NFL.
He's massive too, bro.
Yeah.
Massive. So I'm excited to see. They have Cam Curl. They have some other guys. I think that the biggest question mark for them is really the secondary. They don't have many high end players. A lot of guys that are undrafted. Right? Cam Curl was undrafted. I believe Cam Curl was undrafted, but you have
Yeah, he was.
Cameron Kitchens, who's a 3rd-round pick. You have Quentin Lake, who was a 6th-round pick in 2022. They don't have like a ton of capital. They have Emmanuel Forbes, who was a high-end pick. He might be the highest pick on the board here on the team that they have here. But obviously we know his tenure in Washington wasn't great.
Yeah, he needs some peanut butter and milk sandwiches or something. I don't know what. I thought he was gonna be decent. I think there's a role for where like he has to play. He's got to be able to play off man and just key the quarterback. He's not going to be able to be physical with anybody because he's a toothpick.
Yeah, and that's the thing that sucks, right? And he's long to be physical, right? He's got the
Right.
length that you want from a corner, but he just didn't pan out. But that's gonna do it for us, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Whether you're watching this on the Face Off Sports Network, if you're watching it on the FF Redraft channel over on Chev's channel, make sure you hit that like button. Make sure you hit subscribe. We're gonna continue to pump out content, and it should be a fun season. So thanks a lot for watching.